Good afternoon, everyone. How are you doing on this nice, warm, and humid day? I hear you. I am John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside, and we are very fortunate to have Evan Sullivan joining us this week for America's Veterans After the Conflict to share the history and experiences of some of World War I veterans. This afternoon's session, Constructing Disability After the Great War, Blind Veterans and World War I America, Evan will explore the major social, cultural, and policy changes that affected World War I vets by examining the lives of veterans who were blind as a result of their military service. Evan is an assistant professor of history at SUNY Adirondack and is a historian of disability, gender, and war in the modern era. His book, Constructing Disability After the Great War, Blind Veterans in the Progressive Era, is due out this October. I do ask if you please mute your cell phone ringers and help me in welcoming Dr. Evan Sullivan.
Welcome. Thank you all so much for coming to this talk. Thanks to Lakeside and for John Mann for putting on this important week-long series on veterans history. As John mentioned, I teach history at SUNY Adirondack in Queensbury, New York. Has anybody heard of Queensbury, New York? Oh, okay. So Queensbury is about 9 hours drive from here, straight I-90. I came in yesterday, I'm leaving tomorrow. So it's a long drive, but I've never been to Lakeside before, and this is an amazing community. I'm really, really having a great time here. So thank you for having me. So when thinking about how best to approach giving a talk on veterans issues after World War I, it's a massive field of study. I thought it best to refer back to some of my latest research on blind veterans. The subject of my forthcoming book, the cover is up on the slide there. It's titled Constructing Disability After the Great War, helps shed light on the rehabilitation of disabled veterans as a whole, but also makes important contributions to the field by exploring one of the most culturally salient groups of veterans in the interwar years, those who entered the interwar years with visual impairment. This project first started in 2015 when I was a graduate student researching at the New York State Archives in Albany. It morphed from a project on wartime education policies to one on disability history and the lived experiences of disabled veterans, particularly blind and visually impaired people. My research took me to the Perkins School for the Blind in Massachusetts, which holds the War Blind collection in its library. Further trips to Harvard University, the Maryland Historical Society, and the U.S. National Archive provided a plethora of information with which I wrote this book. And the information that I will be discussing today comes from just one part of one chapter of the book. And this is going to be published in the University of Illinois Press. So before delving into the individual stories of blind veterans, it's important to understand the ways in which warfare changed after 1914. World War I witnessed a plethora of new technologies made to kill and maim humans in the most frightening ways imaginable. Poison gas in many forms assaulted the senses, causing gastrointestinal distress, blindness, and lung disease. The effects of gas were the subject of John Singer Sargent's 1919 painting titled Gassed, which is pictured up there. Sargent's painting depicts a line of blinded soldiers injured from mustard gas making their way back to a casualty clearing station and became one of the most emblematic war paintings in the modern era, signifying the pain and helplessness of soldiers in the face of modern weapons. Machine guns outpaced traditional single-shot rifles, forcing soldiers to advance into the maelstrom of continuous fire. And artillery explosions unleashed hot pieces of jagged metal that tore through human bodies or sometimes left little to no evidence of a deceased soldier's body. In France, for example, nearly half of the 1.4 million soldiers killed were classified as missing or unidentifiable. Especially vulnerable within this context was the human head. Shrapnel, gas, and bullets disfigured hundreds of thousands of soldiers' faces. Specific terms emerged in France and Germany that evoked the traumatic nature of facial and head wounds. The French called facially wounded veterans the men with broken faces, whereas the Germans called them men without faces. Ultimately, hundreds of American soldiers returned with wounds to the head or face and went through years of arduous and painful operations, followed by vocational rehabilitation. Blind veterans counted among the list of head casualties. Over 2,000 soldiers sustained eye wounds during World War I, and in some cases, these were mixed with other sensory wounds. Harry Kiefreiter, for example, was wounded at the age of 25 at Verdun on September 28, 1918. Artillery shrapnel struck him in the face and left arm, destroyed his left eye, and tore through his nasal cavity, emerging from his left cheek. Kiefreiter endured at least 2 operations to clear out his socket and nasal cavity before he entered vocational training. As I'll make clear later in this presentation, blind veterans were not all battlefield casualties like Kiefreiter, as blindness had many different causes, including disease and pre-existing conditions. All of them, nonetheless, became and identified as disabled blind veterans. Disabled World War I veterans lived through a time of tremendous social change, emblematic in the rehabilitation movement. Rehabilitation was in stark contrast to 19th century social welfare provisions for disabled veterans, which centered on providing pensions and assistance from veterans institutions, essentially where veterans lived. Pensions and other forms of assistance defined veterans' experiences after the American Civil War. Progressive era social reformers, trained to find ways to make institutions more efficient, tried to redress the costly American Civil War pension system. Instead of pensions, progressive era reformers turned to vocational training. They turned to medical care to rehabilitate veterans so that they would become economically self-sufficient, productive citizens who in theory would not be reliant on the state for their welfare. As historian Beth Linker persuasively demonstrates in her book War's Waste, progressives argued that through rehabilitation, the American government could rebuild disabled veterans into masculine wage earners and erase the wounds of war, saving money on what would have been the war's human waste. And so, responsibility for Veterans Affairs, which had been under the Pension Bureau during the Gilded Age, moved over to the War Risk Insurance Bureau. This was primarily responsible for loss or damage to U.S. shipping during the war, but it also provided allotments to dependents of soldiers in exchange for a contribution from their wages. The Bureau provided disability insurance and based disability compensation on the extent to which a soldier's impairment reduced their capacity for wage labor. Simultaneously, the Federal Board for Vocational Education oversaw vocational training with the aim of producing economically self-sufficient wage earners, job training programs. And First World War rehabilitation was ultimately driven by a belief in modern medicine, an optimism about curing disability, and a fear of creating a generation of unproductive young male veterans. This is an image that comes from a World War I American hospital, and these are neuropsychiatric patients or patients commonly frequently diagnosed with terms like shell shock. And physical exercise was just as important to rehabilitation in the minds of policymakers as learning a vocation, right? So the other context that's important to understand when exploring the lives of blind American veterans is the prevalence of emotional appeals of blindness before U.S. entry into the war. The United States doesn't enter the war in 1914. It enters the war in 1917. But during that time, between 1914 and 1917, American aid organizations, philanthropic organizations, mobilized behind the image of the blind soldier. One of these organizations, the British, French, and Belgian Permanent Blind Relief War Fund, it's a mouthful, but don't worry about remembering it, held massive galas in cities such as New York City to aid rehabilitation of blind soldiers in Europe, particularly French soldiers they were focused on. The Blind Relief War Fund and similar organizations raised public awareness in the United States about this cause by creating all kinds of representations of blind soldiers as having given the supreme sacrifice in the war, that they were utterly helpless. This was meant to create a sense of urgency for American dollars. Publicity portrayed blind soldiers as the most helpless, depressed, and tragic figures of the war. And this, while good for raising public funds, also created damaging public assumptions about blindness. And this came at a time when blind American civilians were actually achieving greater rights and provisions for themselves through organized political action and through education. One set of sources that we can look to understand how this all worked was the art commissioned for the Blind Relief War Fund. The fund used art for fundraising, and it demonstrates the sheer desperation of their appeal for blind soldiers. American artists contributed sketches and designs of blind soldiers to the organization, and these designs were then printed on literature and collection boxes. The fund wanted the imagery to play on the sympathies of American civilians. Artist F.C. Yan, for example, drew a blinded soldier on the battlefield, holding his hands toward the air, palms outward. The image on the left there. Yan gave a public talk in New York City in May 1916, in which he explained his reasoning behind the drawing. Quote, "In conceiving the figure of a soldier suddenly blinded in battle," he said, "I drew the recently discussed hand turned upward, because I felt that in an overpowering human calamity of this kind, there can be only one appeal, the appeal for divine aid." He continued, "I sought to picture the man not bodily mangled, but realizing his utter helplessness throughout the rest of his life unless aid were given." End quote. Emil Fuchs, his design similarly emphasized dependence and desperation. It showed a blind French officer, quote, groping his way along with a stick and leaning on a child, representing an extreme form of dependence. The child, Fuchs argued, was in a greater position of authority than the blind man in the image. The Blind Relief War Fund used Emil Fuchs's design on its official pamphlet for the purposes of educating potential donors. This is a screenshot on your right from the actual pamphlet. The fund, according to the organization's pamphlet, if you were to read the rest of the pamphlet, which I haven't included here, aimed to show American benevolence to blind soldiers through generosity and through sympathy. After viewing Fuchs's drawing of a child caring for a blind soldier, viewers turned the pamphlet over and read in big, bright, bold red letters, quote, "Think of it, blinded, never again to see mother, father, wife, brother, sister, sweetheart, or friend, never again to look upon the beauties of nature, never again to see, to work, to read, to write, permanently blinded, in all caps. Does he deserve our sympathy, our help? Can there be anyone who can afford to give, no matter how small, who will not? Publicity such as this created a singular idea of what it meant to be blind, without encouraging its sighted audience to understand the actual lived experiences of blind people. Storytellers made no effort to delineate between the very real and traumatic tragedy of a war wound that caused blindness and the existence of blindness and blind people more generally in the United States, who, despite demeaning assumptions about their lives and lack of accessibility, lived fulfilling, complex, and worthy lives. Narratives like this depicted blind people as helpless dependents who required paternalistic aid from sighted people. Additionally, blindness in the context of war generated emotional appeal due to the heroic sense of self-sacrifice that veterans elicited. And philanthropic organizations benefited monetarily from this kind of messaging, regardless of whether the messages were harmful to blind people. Americans latched on to these comfortable assumptions about blind people. And so, when American soldiers returned to the United States with varying levels of visual impairment, the federal government and its allied media outlets recognized that the public perception of blindness needed to shift in support of the new rehabilitation agenda, away from the destitute and depressing stories about blind soldiers in a faraway country in need of American support, and toward an image of blind American soldiers putting on their civilian clothes and getting back to work. And nowhere is this clearer than with the public reception of Sergeant William H. Zimmerman, pictured here. Zimmerman was the first blind soldier to be featured in the U.S. Army Surgeon General magazine titled Carry On. Carry On disseminated important state-sanctioned information to American readers about a new and potentially positive direction in veterans' benefits by highlighting stories about soldiers who benefited from rehabilitation and took up jobs as productive heads of households. And you can read Carry On magazine. It's digitized on the internet, freely available. Before becoming Carry On's first blind soldier, Zimmerman had joined the U.S. Army in 1910 and served in the Philippines, took part in the Pancho Villa expedition in New Mexico, and served in France during World War I. In November 1917, while transporting munitions near the Western Front, Zimmerman's truck skidded and turned over, pinning him underneath, fracturing bones and hemorrhaging his optic nerves, resulting in blindness in both eyes. In May 1918, he became the first American soldier to enter what was called U.S. Army General Hospital No. 7, or colloquially called Evergreen by the students there. And this was the singular U.S. government hospital for blind soldiers. It's located in Baltimore, Maryland, and you can still go there. It's not a rehabilitation school or a hospital, as it once was. It's actually the Humanities building at Loyola University, Maryland. And I walked through the halls of it when I went down to research, and it's the same as it was back then. There, he took courses in Braille, became a massage therapist, and then worked at Fort McHenry, where he provided massage therapy to other wounded soldiers. Carry On noted that Zimmerman was motivated to pursue a successful career because he needed to provide for his girlfriend. You see, he said during his vocational training in 1918, I have got to get a job now because they sent for my girl to come here to see me. And she said, Bill, if you make good, I'm going to marry you. Well, blindness is a handicap, of course, but it is not going to stop me. So soldiers like Zimmerman aimed to, quote unquote, make good, and that was a term used all over the place at this time, by training in a variety of vocations while recuperating from their wounds or illnesses. Rehabilitation success as a federal program was oftentimes contingent on how well veterans acclimated to new vocations, but also how well the state sold success stories of veterans like Zimmerman to the general public. The stories published in Carry On and other outlets about William Zimmerman, and we'll talk about more in a minute here, reflect an overwhelming positivity about and confidence in rehabilitation and the determination of the individual to make good after the war. Visual culture in the form of photographs published in magazines and newspapers also reflects this theme. And we can look to the photographs of a photography company from Washington, D.C. to understand this. Between 1918 and 1921, the Harris and Ewing Photography Company traveled from D.C. to Baltimore to take a series of photographs of blind soldiers in their training at Evergreen. The photographers repeatedly focused on Zimmerman as a subject for their images. One image shows Zimmerman smiling as he stands beside either a family member or an Evergreen visitor. In another photograph, Zimmerman stands in the center of a small group of blind soldiers and 2 women reconstruction aides. Zimmerman was also photographed walking with his cane independently around the perimeter of Evergreen, the photograph pictured here. Harris and Ewing Photography, much like the editors of Carry On, thought Zimmerman was a compelling image of post-war success that differed markedly from the narratives Americans heard about French soldiers who were blinded before 1917, because he was confident, he was cheerful, and he was ready to get back to work. Zimmerman's media narratives are significant, not only because he was the first blind American soldier to enter rehabilitation and to gain widespread attention, but also because he embodied the erroneous American assumption that most, if not all, blind soldiers lost their sight from a wound received in battle or at least near the field of battle. Physical trauma was surely the most common reason for blindness. Fragments from shell explosions, bullets, these things regularly tore through soldiers' eyes along with other parts of the head, causing not just partial or total blindness, but also deafness, loss of smell or taste, and extreme psychological distress. Though some of the early cases may have been caused by explosions, they were not all received during battle. Corporal Henry Bitter, for example, was blinded and lost both of his hands when a grenade accidentally exploded in front of him as he was training new American recruits behind the front, and this happened after the signing of the armistice on November 11th, 1918. Numerous blind American soldiers who arrived at Evergreen in the early months of its existence lost their sight from illness. Some became partially or totally blind from illnesses such as conjunctivitis or inflammation of the eye. Private Charles Burnett became blind after contracting typhoid pneumonia. Frank Pyle's blindness came after he contracted cerebrospinal meningitis. He made all kinds of jokes in his writings about people assuming that he was blinded in battle. Sylvester Boston, a black soldier from Virginia, lost his sight in November 1918 from glaucoma. Ultimately, 3 soldiers at Evergreen were blind after bouts of meningitis, and 1 was blind after contracting gonorrheal ophthalmia. Despite newspaper articles that placed Corporal Otis Speed in the category of wounded, his eyesight had actually weakened gradually during the war until the Army classified him as blind. According to an Evergreen ophthalmologist, at least 6 soldiers were blind from toxic amblyopia, or wood alcohol poisoning. This was during the period of where alcohol consumption was illegal, right? So soldiers did what they could to drink on their free time. Such numbers suggest wider variations of causes for blindness than Carry On and newspaper stories about combat blindness suggest. Additionally, blindness was not an absolute category where one's vision was unchanged or where one was either completely blind or completely sighted. Soldiers were completely blind, or partially blind, or somewhere in between. Sometimes the soldier found that his sight had improved somewhat through rehabilitation, but more often, such men found that their sight deteriorated as the months progressed. And this left many men in an emotionally and physically precarious situation. The ambiguities of blindness and the realities that many blind soldiers were not, in fact, battle blinded were left unexplored in American media. Psychiatric records also suggest complex psychological realities for the newly blind men, which was not evident in the early stories of men like William Zimmerman, though he too was psychologically damaged during the war. Almost all the patients who arrived at Evergreen with battle wounds had recently undergone operations at a nearby U.S. Army hospital, and some men had lingering delirium while recovering from anesthesia, in which they imagined themselves fighting in the trenches, according to one psychiatrist. Half the soldiers also suffered from some kind of psychoneurosis, including concussion, exhaustion, shock, irritability, or extreme nervousness. All of this information comes from psychiatric records that are stored in the National Archives, rather than the information published in Carry On. So William Zimmerman was featured in Carry On based on the erroneous assumption that he represented the majority of blind soldiers, in that he had not sustained a severe visible physical wound, that he had seen battle in the trenches or at least had been near battle, and because he clearly traced his blindness to a physical wound sustained in the war. Many, but by no means all, of the soldiers at Evergreen were blinded in battle, and many were partially blind, possessing limited vision in both eyes or in one eye, rather than completely blind. A not inconsequential number of soldiers were blind through pre-existing illness that was aggravated by military service, or from illness or circumstances related to their military service. Most of the soldiers at Evergreen had wounds in addition to blindness, including other sensory wounds, amputations, and severe psychological trauma. These points are significant because most stories that military authorities or newspapers told about blind soldiers at Evergreen, or disabled soldiers more generally, either played down these facts or ignored them altogether, which suggests that media outlets were mindful of how the images they chose to report would be received by readers. Finally, Zimmerman also appeared in Carry On because the media regularly used blind soldiers to symbolize the worst wound one could sustain, but that American soldiers had the capability to overcome such supposed calamity. Newspapers and magazines focused on blind soldiers because they were compelling and because of the emotional appeal of the injury, evident through the stories about French soldiers before 1917. These figures had, according to public appeals for sympathy, heroically and tragically lost their sight from shell explosions or bullets. And despite having a body miraculously free of scarring, which was not always true, they were left unable to see with their eyes and therefore could not use their bodies to their full potential, as the messaging suggested. In contrast to the pre-1917 stories about blind French soldiers, the post-1917 stories about American soldiers struck a resoundingly positive tone. Take New York soldier George Calvert, for example, who was blinded in battle by a shell fragment. But he assured Americans back home, quote, "Don't let any of the home folks worry about me. Uncle Sam is going to train me so that I shall be about as useful as I was before the war," end quote. Figures like William Zimmerman and George Calvert elicited similar emotions from the American public that blind French soldiers had, but quickly reassured the public that they were different and were indeed carrying on or making good. By highlighting these soldiers and their positive reactions to their blindness, magazines and newspapers sought to convey to other wounded soldiers the message that if blinded soldiers could do it with a wound worse than any other wound, so could you. Zimmerman also proved compelling to Carry On editors because of the socioeconomic roles he occupied. So one significant aim of rehabilitation was for the soldier patient to work hard to fulfill his role as the breadwinner of the family. Historian Beth Linker has argued that rehabilitationists envisioned the workplace, rather than a pension, as ensuring a stable and well-ordered life through which married men could provide for their family. Carry On made this point explicit through its Creed of the Disabled Soldier, which was printed in numerous editions of the magazine. The Creed argued that it was the goal of every disabled soldier, once more to be useful, to see pity in the eyes of my friends replaced with commendation, to work, produce, provide, and to feel that I have a place in the world, seeking no favors and given not, a man among men in spite of this physical handicap. Linker writes, seen in this way, economic dependency, often linked overtly and metaphorically to womanliness, came to be understood as the real handicap that thwarted the physical recovery of the veteran and the fiscal strength of the nation. So the editors of Carry On unquestionably drove this point home with William Zimmerman. Zimmerman's primary reason, if we remember, for training hard after being blinded in the war, was to make good so that he could marry his girlfriend. Carry On placed sexuality and masculinity front and center alongside work when crafting the ideal of the successful veteran. Zimmerman was blind, according to the magazine, but his disability didn't stop him from having a fulfilling relationship with a woman. Zimmerman, though, got the girl because he succeeded in vocational training and secured a job with a steady income. The fact that his story was compelling enough to be featured in the first edition of Carry On in June 1918 reinforces the ways that Americans refocused imagery about blind soldiers away from dependence and depression to emphasize independence and happiness. This is an actual picture of Evergreen, if you're curious, right? That was taken, I think, in 1919. It's held at the Library of Congress, which has all kinds of really interesting photographs from that photography company that I talked about. But again, if you go to Baltimore, if you take a drive to Baltimore, look up Loyola University and find their Humanities Center, and it looks exactly like that, just a little bit more green, right? So between August 1917, when Zimmerman arrived, and October 1919, blind soldiers proliferated throughout popular American magazines. By mid-1919, when many American magazines published stories about blind soldiers, U.S. fighting in World War I had been over for 6 months, and the new work of bringing hundreds of thousands of soldiers back to the United States was underway. Over 200,000 U.S. soldiers were wounded, sick, or disabled, and about 120,000 disabled soldiers had passed through the U.S. Army's rehabilitation program. This meant that American publications had a plethora of subjects to profile in their magazines, in their journals and newspapers, including a number of blind soldiers. Some of the stories published after World War I sought to depict the actual experiences of blind soldiers in rehabilitation. In January 1919, for example, William Zimmerman took a reporter from the New York Times Magazine on a tour of Evergreen. Zimmerman, who was apparently doomed by his, quote, personal tragedy to the long prospect of darkened years and hopelessness, stunned the reporter with his confidence, quote, as one who steps boldly and happily out into the world and who bore no sign of being a hospital patient. Zimmerman embodied the spirit of Evergreen, according to this author, going about his day with perfect normality, enjoying a cigarette, reading in the library, and dancing with women. Ultimately, the reporter concluded, Zimmerman is not a man who is afflicted, he is a man who has a handicap and who is overcoming it. The New York Times Magazine reporter was interested in Zimmerman because he was a curiosity and because he provided a convenient overcoming narrative for readers to digest. Zimmerman was not supposed to be happy or confident because the cultural constructions about blind soldiers that proliferated before 1917 suggested that such people were hopeless and depressed without their ability to see. The reporter found Zimmerman's optimism an oddity, precisely because of the reporter's ableist views about blindness that suggested blind people were hopelessly dependent and condemned to a life of isolation. Zimmerman's ability to spiritually overcome supposedly insurmountable mental and physical odds served to motivate others to succeed in their own lives, because as the message suggested, they themselves were not blind. Blind soldier overcoming narratives showed up elsewhere in post-war literature. Collier's magazine reporter Samuel Hopkins Adams also toured Evergreen, where he met many of America's first blind soldiers, including William Zimmerman. The product of Samuel Adams' tour was an article titled Blinks that appeared in the June 1919 issue of the National Magazine, which gave readers an inside view of the daily lives of Evergreen soldiers during rehabilitation, while at the same time providing something of a morality tale about hard work and the U.S. Army's ability to reconstruct its wounded soldiers. So the story first introduces blind soldier Sid, who descended from a large staircase in Evergreen's lounge area to inform his fellow Blinks, as the men called themselves, that the doctor pronounced him completely blind in both eyes. "Welcome to the band of Blinks, good for Sid," said the others in response. It was a bewildering conversation for a layman to listen to, wrote Adams. The members of the group below appeared to be congratulating the newcomer on having been declared stone blind, he said. Samuel Adams' story seems to suggest that what he witnessed at Evergreen challenged his perception of blind people as being inherently dependent and unquestionably depressed about their lack of sight. Adams' story is, first and foremost, a redemptive morality tale. It centered around a blind sailor who arrived at Evergreen and could not get used to life as a blind man. As the story opens in Evergreen's comfortable living room, pictured here, another photograph from the photography company, where blind soldiers are sitting in luxurious chairs, keeping each other company. The sailor is off to the side and despondent, as Adams writes, a melancholy wreck, until William Zimmerman invites the sailor to follow him around campus. Adams juxtaposed the two men who seemed to be completely opposite in their outlook. Zimmerman, according to Adams, was a strapping, upstanding, fine-looking young sergeant who stood upright, looked you square in the eye, a man among men who in half an hour's association makes you actually forget his disability. By contrast, the sailor was, quote, slow, uncertain, shuffling with slumped shoulders, and malaise of spirit within. It was only after his association with Zimmerman and hearing about the many activities and general busyness of the soldiers at Evergreen that the sailor made a marked transformation into a more confident person. Zimmerman, according to Adams, had a power for morale among his fellows. Adams felt that from his short time visiting Evergreen and through his interactions with William Zimmerman and the sailor, he had come to understand the, quote, psychology of the newly blinded. On the one hand, confident blind soldiers were more idealistic and passionately carried out their rehabilitation with courage, with patience, determination, and cheerfulness. At the opposite extreme were the men who remained bewildered, anxious, timid, a helpless traveler in a strange land, he says, who would eventually fall into the apathy of self-distrust and become a mere inert, tragic dependent upon the government pension, unless carefully handled, in his words. The story ended as Zimmerman stood up from his chair, stretched his powerful, clean-built form, and gave one last appeal to the audience. Quote, "We fellow Blinks, it's a great life if you don't weaken it." Blind soldier George Calver added to Adams's morality tale about the so-called psychology of the newly blinded and the individual's need to remain determined rather than despondent. Calvert exclaimed that work was important for him while he was going through vocational training, as it empowered him. Further, he suggested that pensions, what the progressive era tried to do away with ultimately, could be potentially ruinous for a person's life. Quote, "What good is it to you," he stated, "when you don't have the feeling of working for it?" Calvert cited the story of a school friend named Benny, who became blind after a fireworks explosion at a 4th of July picnic. Benny had a family that catered to his every need, providing him with a car and a chauffeur, numerous trips, and a guide dog. Calvert said, quote, "They did everything for him but teach him a job," end quote. One day, Benny brushed his teeth, but instead of using toothpaste, he supposedly used a chloroform mixture, and he died as a result. Now, whether this story is true or not, Calvert concluded that if only he had been trained properly, if he had been at Evergreen and learned to be a self-sufficient blind person, he would have been trained to know that the bottle was chloroform, and he would have lived. Samuel Hopkins Adams' Blinks article sought to bring William Zimmerman and his comrades beyond the pages of Carry On to a broader reading population, while also providing reassurance to Americans that wounds could be overcome through grit, hard work, and positive reinforcement, rather than the foundational changes in the built environment and in non-disabled people's ableist thinking about blind people. Blinks did not want the public's sympathy or a government pension, as Calvert and others suggested. Instead, according to Collier's messaging, blind American soldiers actively determined their own destinies. So Evergreen underwent numerous institutional changes in the fall of 1919, the most significant of which was the closure of U.S. Army General Hospital No. 7, which meant the demobilization of blind soldiers into blind veterans, as well as the transfer of all Evergreen operations to the Red Cross Institute for the Blind that had been in operation up until that point, but was an auxiliary organization that aided the U.S. Army. Free from military discipline by the end of 1919, newly demobilized veterans at the Red Cross Institute for the Blind experienced notable changes in their everyday lives. New educational opportunities, better sleeping and eating arrangements, and post-rehabilitation outreach programs made life palatable and promoted independence. Culturally speaking, the most significant change at Evergreen was the Red Cross Institute for the Blind's publication of Evergreen Review, which was a rehabilitation magazine that kept interested readers up to date with daily life at the Institute for a small subscription fee. You can read Evergreen Review online. It's available freely. The Evergreen Review is significant, in part because it provides important, although triumphalist, depictions of daily life at Evergreen during its formative years. Photographs of the Institute's grounds and stories about blind veterans training in agriculture, in commercial sales, woodworking, and other vocational pursuits, while also engaging in sporting events with their blind comrades, were further extensions of Carry On's work to sell rehabilitation to the American public. Two themes stand out with the Evergreen Review and how it tried to appeal to its sighted readers because of how similar they were to earlier media representations of blind soldiers. First, the Evergreen Review documented the regular appearances of famous people who visited Evergreen to signify the men's elevated social capital as blind veterans who had widespread sympathetic appeal from society. Second, the regular column titled "Who's Who Among Our Buddies" chronicled blind veterans who succeeded after their vocational training. The Evergreen Review ultimately aimed to convey to its readers that blind veterans were unquestionably socioeconomically independent or worker citizens who had little or no problem acclimating to a post-war America. So the numerous famous individuals who visited Evergreen and appeared in the Evergreen Review left little doubt that blind soldiers were worthy of the cited public's attention. Visitors included the Queen of Belgium, who arrived at the end of 1919, and who was particularly interested in sending a Belgian attaché to study vocational training methods that could be later applied to Belgian soldiers. Elizabeth Baker, the wife of U.S. Secretary of War Newton Baker, visited Evergreen on February 14, 1920. Baker's visit was memorable for the blind soldiers there because she brought with her 75 Braille watches to give to blind veterans so that they could tell time through their sense of touch. I've actually corresponded with an ancestor of one of these blind soldiers who still has that watch, which is pretty neat. On April 13th, 1920, General John Pershing, the commanding general of the American Expeditionary Forces during World War I, visited Evergreen and spoke to the blind veterans there and reported feeling inspiration from seeing them in vocational training. Unquestionably, the most important visits to Evergreen were from Helen Keller. Keller's interactions, and we know Helen Keller famously being blind and deaf, Keller's interactions with the men suggested that she understood their work in overcoming their disabilities, and that the men's experiences should ultimately serve to inspire other disabled veterans who were not blind. Keller visited Evergreen in 1918, in February 1919, and again in March 1920. She stated in a speech to blind soldiers in February 1919 that the hardest part of being blind was the loss of personal liberty, but that through the cultivation of the other senses, through alert minds and courageous hearts, the blind soldiers, quote, shall find plenty of interesting adventures in dark land. She encouraged her audience to console yourselves with work, get busy, put your mind on the job at hand. Every triumph you win, she said, will help other fellows who are handicapped to make good. And that their greatest victory in life as blind soldiers turned civilians was not living a fulfilling life necessarily, but inspiring other disabled people with confidence in themselves and their capabilities. This is an image of George Calvert, actually, in the foreground, with Helen Keller and some others at the Institute walking the grounds. The Queen of Belgium, General John Pershing, and Helen Keller lent a sense of authority and urgency to Evergreen. Their visits to Evergreen increased public awareness, increased support for blind American soldiers. The visitors focused on inspirational narratives of soldiers overcoming their disabilities and argued that though blind soldiers had an almost insurmountable disability, they conquered their disabilities through sheer individual will. This was especially the case with Keller, whose own identity and public acclaim rested in part on the public's perception that she heroically overcame her own disability. The Evergreen Review's regular column, Who's Who Among Our Buddies, performed a similar function of inspiration. As Evergreen was a vocational training institution, much of the Evergreen Review highlighted the lives of blind veterans who were training for, who had already successfully completed their work. Harvey Gilbert, for example, was profiled in the magazine after he opened his Victory Store No. 2 in Perryville, Maryland. Gilbert's Victory Store No. 2 was modeled after Victory Store No. 1, which was a model training store opened at Evergreen under the direction of the Red Cross. The store trained blind veterans in commercial sales, carrying such items as tobacco, candy, and toiletries. When Gilbert opened his own store in Perryville, he welcomed around 200 customers who purchased a total of $157 worth of merchandise that first day. Gilbert, who put Braille on every shelf in his store, sold the tobacco and candy during the early rush, and his wife sold the other products. The two proved to be, quote, hardworking, reliable people who will make good whatever the difficulties. The Evergreen Review highlighted Harvey Gilbert's store opening because his experience underscored patterns of successful rehabilitation that the Red Cross hoped to replicate. First, Gilbert succeeded in part because of the steadfast support of his wife, who worked diligently in the store by his side. He did not necessarily need her help, as the article suggested, but his knowledge of Braille, combined with his training in sales, made his independence almost assured. Evergreen's commercial department emphasized other men who received help from family or friends. Harry Willian, for example, leaned on help from his sister Mabel. Willian's eyesight failed while in Army training, and he ultimately took courses in insurance sales. And the Red Cross encouraged Willian's sister Mabel to train with him at Evergreen. And in May 1919, Mabel and Harry started work at the Mutual Benefit Life Insurance Company of New Jersey. And you can see the two of them in that picture there. The bottom photograph is an image of Victory Store number 1 on the grounds of Evergreen. Despite the Evergreen Review's carefully crafted messaging, it would be a mistake to suggest that all the graduates succeeded. The Evergreen Review met James Rittervold's story with enthusiasm. Rittervold was a Norwegian immigrant who joined the American Expeditionary Forces and was blinded in battle just 2 days before the armistice. He entered Evergreen in April 1919, studied sales, and opened his own store in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right outside Boston, where he sold coffee and tea. Rittervold prided himself in his new venture and wrote to his former comrades, who were still in training at Evergreen, that they needed to get rid of this assumption that because they were blind, the world should lie at their feet. The sooner they get that out of their heads, he concluded, the better it will be for them and for others with whom they come into contact. James Rittervold did not remain so steadfast in his ideas of rugged individualism. By April 1921, his coffee and tea business struggled to make ends meet. I keep my own accounts and sell my products, he stated. I deliver goods anywhere in Greater Boston free of charge. I am striving to make myself an asset to society and not a liability. Nonetheless, Rittervold recruited the services of a group of Cambridge women who lobbied on his behalf. Records don't exist explaining why Rittervold's business struggled, but Rittervold claimed that it was because of, quote, the laggard public, a public that was unwilling to give him a fair shot and sufficient support by purchasing from his store, that stood between himself and independence. Wittingly or not, Rittervold identified ableism, public unwillingness to support a disabled person, as the chief reason for his struggles, rather than his individual work ethic. The Cambridge women's efforts, the newspaper publicity, or possible business changes Rittervold made ultimately turned his coffee and tea company around. By the end of the year, it was profitable again. Harvey Gilbert's store also suggested that his struggles did not appear in the pages of the Evergreen Review. Gilbert's story continued in the pages of the Baltimore Evening Sun, which reported on blind veterans who were seeking money to fund a permanent home for blind veterans who were struggling economically by 1924. Gilbert spoke about his life after Evergreen. Quote, I went home in 1920 and set up in business. I found everyone very sympathetic, but they did not patronize my store, and I went broke. I had just enough money to get back here and decided to come and stay, end quote. Like James Rittervold, Harvey Gilbert blamed his store's failures not on a lack of training, but on cited society's unwillingness to patronize his store, and ultimately a lack of confidence in his abilities because of his blindness. Top right is Rittervold in the Evergreen Review, bottom left is Harvey Gilbert. So rehabilitation officials had grand expectations for U.S. Army General Hospital No. 7. Blind American soldiers, as rehabilitation leaders and media authorities suggested, were not going to be the helpless, independent men that Americans had envisioned from stories about French soldiers. Instead, Evergreen officials and media partners highlighted stories that emphasized independence. Early stories about Evergreen men overwhelmingly emphasized the men's work ethic and their battlefield wounds, even if hospital records indicate that not all Evergreen men were battlefield casualties. Media representations suggested that blind soldiers were unquestionably cheerful and optimistic about their futures and stood as inspirational figures to other people with disabilities, because many Americans considered blindness as the ultimate disability that hindered one's ability to take an active part in public life. Left unexplored in these exposés of success were the soldiers who struggled economically, or who did not fit the mold of the battle-blinded war hero, and the responsibility of society for marginalizing disabled people to begin with, through inaccessible public and private spaces, as well as stigmatizing attitudes toward disability. The literature in Carry On, the Evergreen Review, and the various newspapers and magazines that spotlighted blind soldiers and veterans nonetheless represented a significant attempt to shift conversations about blindness to better align with the needs of wartime rehabilitation. In so doing, this literature overshadowed the complex physical and vocational realities experienced by many blind veterans. Thank you. And I'll just add that my book isn't out yet, but if you're interested in taking a flyer with you, I have one about public speaking engagements and one about my book. So feel free to come up and grab one and take it with you. Thank you.
Are there any records as to how they determined who was eligible for Evergreen? That is, what level of visual impairment did you need to have to get in there?
Yes. And I do get into that in other parts of the book, especially when you're talking about eligibility for disability compensation as a veteran, because that depended also on the extent of your blindness. If you were blind in both eyes, you had total disability, but that wasn't the case if you were partially blind in one eye. So there are all sorts of records, whether you're looking at magazines and newspapers from the U.S. Army War Department or the Surgeon General's office, or looking at congressional testimony, which is also available for public viewing. Yeah, there are all sorts of records out there that go into that in greater detail. And one interesting tidbit is that if we're talking about who was included in Evergreen and who was not included, one group of people who were not included in Evergreen, and I can't figure out why, it's a part of my ongoing research, women who were blinded in their service during as Army nurses. And part of the reason why there's not a lot of information on it is because there were two. I know their names. One of them earned all kinds of commendations. And there's a lot of records on her. And she actually was blinded in one eye and continued to serve in the war until the end. The other, there are like 2 newspaper articles about this person and no indication about why she didn't get included at Evergreen, whether she wanted to in the first place. But she was definitely included with veterans of Evergreen, male veterans, because she was part of the veterans organizations that male blinded veterans put together. But she just wasn't at Evergreen. And so I've looked at every piece of institutional record left back in the National Archives from Evergreen, every newspaper article that I could find, and there's no indication about why women nurses weren't included.
Thank you for the reference to Elizabeth Baker. She was the wife of Newton Baker, who was the founder of my law firm in Cleveland.
Oh, wow.
But pertinent to this, she was a trustee of the Cleveland Society for the Blind.
Oh, okay.
Some years later,
yeah.
my late wife was a trustee of that organization, and that, of course, is similar in tradition to Evergreen.
Yes, yeah. And there were a few blind veterans who were very active in Ohio. one veteran in particular who I document. His name was Michael Aronson. He has 3 books that he wrote and published, and his papers are in the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati, I think it is. And so there's a lot of connections between this story and Ohio, which is really kind of interesting.
This is probably at the margin, and it may be something you never touched on. Did you encounter any, in your reading or research, any discussion of temporary blindness of the type that I've read? One of my passions, since I'm a recovering attorney also, since retirement has been reading about Hitler. And you know, there are different theories whether it was physical, psychological, and what treatment cured it.
Okay. Yeah, so I'd say I touch on something related to that. And that has to do with the overwhelming numbers of French soldiers who were temporarily blinded, and British soldiers who were temporarily blinded using forms of gas before mustard gas even existed. So when organizations like the Blind Relief War Fund are trying to sell philanthropy to the American public, they're using inflated numbers. 10, 20,000 blinded soldiers in the war zone that need your help. The reality was that out of all the countries involved in World War I, there were maybe 7,000 or 8,000 total out of the whole course of the war. But we're just talking in the first 6 to 12 months of the war. And, or the first year or 2 of the war, I should say. And the reason for that is because, or one possible reason is that I speculate in the book, based on evidence about different forms of gas, is that what the observers were seeing, who were reporting back to the New York Times or whatever about all of these massive casualty numbers of blindness, may have been their experience, but would they have known the difference between temporary blindness and permanent blindness? All they were seeing was a snapshot in time. And a lot of the numbers of blind soldiers who were blind as a result of gas. Mustard gas isn't something that comes until 1917. A lot of the early forms of gas may have irritated the eyes, but they didn't necessarily cause blindness. And so temporary forms of blindness, conjunctivitis or whatever, was definitely a thing.
I was struck by your pictures. You did a great job of finding those old pictures. But 2 things. One, did you ever go to the American Red Cross to ask to go through their files? Because they made a huge impact on the First World War, especially, you know, the prisoner of wars and things like that. And then the second thing that's fascinating is that they realized what society was, and they didn't try to change society. They adapted to society. Mm-hmm. Because one of the most famous people that was injured in the First World War was Ernest Hemingway. Mm-hmm. And that generation, they really thought masculinity was taking care of yourself. I mean, some people might speculate that that's why he committed suicide, because he didn't think he could function. Mm-hmm. But anyway, the fascinating thing is that society had such definite opinions about things. And this group, you know, adapted to that. Do you have any comments about it yourself? I mean, your study was just fascinating because, you know, the Belgian relief during the First World War was so important in the United States. Helen Keller was so important. I mean, they touched on every, you know, hot button for the American public during the First World War.
Yeah, they were very cognizant about what would appeal to readership. And I hate to say it was a marketing tactic, but at some point there's a little bit of that going on because you need a public that's going to support this effort, right? as far as the Red Cross records are concerned, I did look for Red Cross records, and a lot of the records from that time period were handed over to the National Archives. And so, for example, the Red Cross made a film about showing blind soldiers going about their day at Evergreen. And the National Archives has that film. But I was unable to find any paper records from that experience. Only already published records.
Thank you very much, Evan. Thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.